Today's daf is daf mem beis, and after wishing you a Shavua Tov, let's start with the last few words on daf mem aleph amid beis to ease into today's daf. Ki osar avdimi omer Rabbi Yochanan sholosh l'shon shamati. I heard three variations or distinctions with regard to shir and achas shel para, achas shel soyer, hamishtalech, achas shel mitzorah. And we're talking about the weight, the mishkal. And we'll explain that we're dealing with lishonos, referring to lishonos, meaning different formulations and transmissions referring to lishonos. Lishonos are those strips of crimson that are added in three cases. Achas, one of these three strips, has to have a weight, a mishkal, of asara zuz. The achas, another one, of these three, a mishkal of shnei sloim. So we have 10 zuz. We've got 2 sloim. The achas mishkal shekel. And one has the weight of only a shekel. Ve'enli lefarish, but I don't know which one belongs to which. We have the para, we have the soyer, we have the mitzorah. How do we divvy this up? Kiyasa Ravin, who was the second Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan that came from Eretz Yisrael, besides Rabbi Dimi, and he came to Bavel, Pirsha Mishmei Rabbi Yonasan, and he had an interpretation in the name of Rabbi Yonasan, according to Tosfos, is another Girsia in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Now we start the daf for today. Para, with regard to that lashon, that strip for the paraduma, and we need here a certain weight, and that's because the pasuk says l'toch sreifas hapara, that it's got to fall deeply into the fire. So we need a weighty strip, and therefore mishkal asarazus, mishal sorah mishtaleach, there we need a certain weight in order to split it into half, because half will be tied up to the boulder before we send it over the precipice. The other half is between its karnayim, is mishkal shnei sloi. So we don't need anywhere near the weight of the lashon of the para, which is asar zuz, but we need the weight of mishkal shnei sloi, mishal mitzorah. It doesn't need any weight at all, and we don't split it into two. It's very small, a minimum. And all we need is mishkal shekel. Om Rabbi Yochanan, pligi ba Rabbi Shimon bar Chalafta v'Rabbanan b'Para. As far as the shear, the minimum weight of the lashon hazahuris of this crimson strip regarding the paraduma, we had one opinion. Chad Omar mishkal asara, meaning zuz, 10 zuz. Chad Omar mishkal shekel. B'simonach, and if you want an easy way of remembering this so that you shouldn't make any mistakes, is therefore echad hamarba v'echad hamamit, which is a quotation of a Mishnah in Masechet Menachos with regard to those who contribute voluntarily to the Mizbeach. And the siman is that whatever you can bring, as long as you have a kavanah l'shem shamayim, that's what is critical. And that's a zecher l'davar, to remember that one of these two gave the shir hamaruba, the largest of all shiurim, and that's asara zuz, in the case of the lashons of the paraduma, and the other one gave the mamayit. He was giving it the minimum, and that's just a shekel. In between the two extremes, we have a shir beinani, that's the middle of the road, that's shnei slon. But at this point, we don't know, with regard to the machlokas between Rabbi Shimon and Chalafta and the Rabbanan, who holds what? We're not mentioning anything. We know that they are maintaining the two polar extreme opinions. Amalei Rabbi Yomi difti l'Ravina. This machlokas between Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta and the Rabbanan about the mishkal, whether it's 10 zuzim or 1 shekel, lo bid, and we'll add the word lashon, lo b'lashon shel para pli. They're not arguing about the strip of the para. That's the way Rabbi Yochanan taught it to us. Ella bishel soyer mishtalech pli. They were arguing about that strip, that crimson red strip of a wool that was attached to the Sarah Mishtaleh. On this, they had an argument. And Vahu Yoma, on that very day in which they had this debate about the Sarah Mishtaleh, Noch Nafshe, it was the day in which Ravya Bar Kisei, one of the Chachamim of that generation, died. The Anuba Simone. And this gave us a simon, a pneumatic device through which we could remember the machlokes about Sarah Mishtalech. Ravya Bar Kisei Mechaper b'Sarah Mishtalech. He's the one who, because Misas Tzadikim Mechaperes, he brought out the kapara of Yoma Kippur. And the Gemara says in Moikad Mechavches Lama Nisbucha Misas Aaron lebigdei kahuna lomar ma bigdei kahuna mechaper mafnisat tzadikim mechaperes, and the semen for this is to know that there was a machlokas about the Sarah Mishtalech on the very day in which we achieved Klal Yisrael, the kapara of the Sarah Mishtalech, which was the death, the anniversary of the death of Ravya Bar Kisei. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, shtei shchitos shamati. I heard a distinction between two shchitos. Which of the two of them are kosher? Achas shel para. In the case of para aduma, the Torah says, "Unesatem osa el Elazar kohen v'shachato solofanov." And achas shel para, we know that in the case of Parshas Achrimos, the parshal kohen gadol Yom Kippurim vehikriv Aaron esparachatos v'shachad esparachatos shelo achas ksheir bizar v'achas psula bizar v'lo yadana haminayim. I have a tradition that in one of these two shchitos, whether it's that of the para or that of the soyer of the parachatos of the kohen gadol on Yom Kippurim, a zar is kosher. I don't know which one is which. One in one case, whether it's para, whether it's the parachatos shel kohen gadol, the zar is kosher. In the other case, he's possible. I don't know which is which. So the Gemara now brings a machlokes as to which is which. Itmar. We learned in the Beis Medrash shchitas para, in the case of the shchita of the para aduma, and shchitas para shel kohen gadol b'yom kippurim. We have a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. Which one is ksheira b'zar? Which one is psula b'zar? Chad Omar para psula para ksheira. And in that sense, the shechita of the par of kohen gadol is radically different than the shechita of any other carbon, which is ksheira b'zar. But here, since the Torah says regarding the partial Yom Kippurim of the kohen gadol, it says v'kriv Aaron. The Torah is telling me that when the end of the pasuk says v'shachad es parachatos, the v'shachad goes back on Aaron, and it restricts the shechita to a kohen. In this case, the kohen gadol. However, in par, which we discussed in Parah Aduma, is more of a different level of kedusha. It's not a carbon that's brought in the mizbeach in the Beis Hamikdash. There we could be more mekil with regard to shechita. Ad Omar, the other opinion is just the opposite. Oro psula, we have to upgrade the requirement of shechita in par, because the Torah says v'nasatem osa el Elazar kohen v'shachat, etc. And a zar is possible, but para psula. Again, chad omar para psula and chad omar para psula. If it's para psula, it's because the Torah says nasatem elazar kohen. If it's the par of the kohen gadol, that's because the Torah says v'kriv Aaron v'shach. Tistayim, the Gemara wants to prove the Ravu the Omar para psula. A zar is disqualified for the shechita of the paraduma, and we'll prove that based on a statement of Rav, because the Omar Abzera shchitas para bizar psula. Rabbi Zera said that a non-Kohen is disqualified from shechting the paraduma, and Omar Rav, Allah Rav supports the position and brings a proof to Rabbi Zera. And he quotes the pasuk El Lazar v'chuka shaninuba, which means that in the Parsha Paradum it says v'nasatem osa el Elazar kohen, and that's in Bamidbar Perik Yutes pasuk Gimel. And in the previous pasuk, at the beginning of that parsha, it says Zos Chuka Sator. Whenever it says Chuka, it tells you that's ma'akid. And if you change it, you disqualify. Now, the Shechita, the para, requires a loza, because it says, Unasatem el elozar akohen, b'shachado solufana. And the added word chuka tells me that you can't change, you can't deviate. It's got to be a lozer who's doing the Shechita. Therefore, Shechita sapar is kshera only in the case of a kohen and not in the case of a zar. And if Rav is the one who says that para is psula bizar, it means that paro, in the case of the Kohen Gadol, brings his kar Yoma Kippur, is kshera bizar. Shmuel holds the other way, that para kshera, paro psula. So the Gemara now explains the logic of Rav. What is the deeper meaning in Rav's statement? He says, Maishna para. And at the face of it, Rav doesn't make any sense. There's a certain inconsistency in Rav. Why? Because in the case of Para Duma, what you have is a pasuk that's Elazar v'chuka, and that generates a requirement, an absolute critical requirement to the Kohen, to the exclusion of Azar and Shvitas Par going to Rav. Wait a second. Let's look at the parsha of Paro Shel Kohen Gadol Yom Kippurim. Paro Nami Al Ksiv Aaron. It says, "Vayikriv Aaron is parachatos shelo," and Chuka, and the pasuk says, just a few psukim later in that same parsha, it says, "V'hoisa zos lochem l'chukas olam l'chaper al bnei Yisrael." So if it opens up with Aaron and it ends with Chuka, it's telling you that it's got to be a Kohen. It can't be a Zar. Rav answers, no. There's a fundamental difference between Paro Shel Aaron, which is kosher b'zar, b'shchita zar, because Shchita Lav Avodim. We have a general principle with regard to Shchita in the Beis HaMikdash, with regard to all the Karbanos. It's not called an Avodah. It's not an Avodas HaKarbanos. A Zar is kosher for Shchita. And therefore the Chukah in this parsha is referring to the general Chukah of all Karbanos. And that governs the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol like it governs and regulates all karbanos, which means kshera, shchita, kshera, bizar. So the chukah, in the context of Paro Shel Kohen Gadol, is referring to the chukah of all the avodos, which allows shchita bizar because shchita lav avot. Gemara asks, immediately objects, if that be the case, is paranami? Why don't we logically assume that in paraduma there should be no psul, according to Rav, of shchita zar, because certainly we're not talking about an avoda. If you're telling me that in par the shchita is ksher because shchita lav avoda, then certainly how much more so in the case of the para, which is not even in the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara gives a challenging answer, something that at the face of it is quite paradoxical. The Gemara says, Shani para is different than all karbanos. The kodshe berek habayis he. In other words, we don't bring the para aduma on the mizbeach. It only has therefore a low level of hekdesh and kedusha called kedushas damin. In other words, kedushas mizbeach means when someone says harezu ola, and as kedushas haguf, you have to be makriv on the mizbeach, and by virtue of his kedushas per. And if a person dedicates money, for example, to hekdesh, it goes to the tzarchei berek habayis. And in a certain sense, the status of the paraduma is like kodshe berek habayis. And with regard to berek habayis, heim yechazku is berek habayis l'chol hashayimtza sham bedek. So if you have breakages and they have to be fixed up in the berek habayis, we take from that hekdesh and berek habayis. But paraduma is far away from kedushas mizbeach, kedushas haguf. It's kedushas damin. And where does the shchita of the paraduma take place? It's on Har HaZeisim. It's not in the Azara like any other shchita of any karma. So therefore, we don't have, says Rav, the ability to. Now again, the logic here is very difficult because Adarab, if you're lowering the level of the kedusha, the hegdesh of paraduma, then how much more so should you lower the restrictions and not require a Kohen and allow for a Zar? If a Zar works in Kodshe, a Guf Kodshe Mizbeach, which is going to be the Gemara's Kal V'chomer in just a minute, but just understand Rav and put Rav's statement into some perspective. Rav is saying that with regard to Chukah in Karbanos, that which is brought in on the Mizbeach, you can make differentiations. You could say that there are these avodos and this shchita is a separate entity. It's not an avoda. And maybe when it says chukah and paro shel kohen gadol, it's referring to the chukah of shchita of all korbanos. But in the case of paraduma, here we're dealing with berek habayis, kedushas berek habayis, and therefore we don't have any room to make any distinctions and say, well, when it says chukah, it refers to other avodos other than shchita. I mean, there are no avodos in paraduma. There's no din of avod in kodshe berek habayis. So if in the Maisa Parah the Torah employs the word chukah, obviously it's telling me that shchita in paraduma is like all the other avodos that we do in paraduma. There's no room to distinguish between shchita and other avodos and the other parts of paraduma. Mirz Hashem will go through all the parts of paraduma, the segments and the avodos of paraduma, but that's not an avod in Mikdash. So the Gemara asks, "Olav kol shkeinu," like the chaf of the kain is in place of a shiv. Isn't there a kal v'chomer? If the case of parot shel Aaron b'yom Kippur, which has kedushas aguf, and chukah does not preclude the kashrus of a zar for shchita, how much more so in the paraduma, which is only kodesh berek habayis, we don't have that higher demand of to disqualify a zar for the shchita. How can you tell me, Rav, that the zar is possible shchita? The more answers on Rav Shesha Brei, to Rav Idi, Midi Dehavi Amaros Negoim. There are many functions that are singularly and exclusively placed on the shoulders of the Kohen Gadol, the Kohanim, even though despite the fact that they are not avodos and they're not part of Kedushas Haguf. And I'll give you an example to prove my point. In the entire parsha of Negoim, of Re'iyas Negoim, it's the Kohen who, and only the Kohen, who will determine whether or not this phenomenon on the body of a mitzvah is actually tamei or tar. And the Torah says explicitly, "Vayikra Yud Gimel Adam ki yeh ba'ar b'saro se'eso sapatz b'heres v'yah ba'ar b'saro l'neget saras v'huva el Aaron HaKohen." So you see that there's certain ma'asim, certain performances, certain rituals that are totally and exclusively in the realm and the domain of the Kohen. And paraduma is exactly the same. We're not going to be machalik between the shchita of the paraduma and any of the other avodos and the parts of the process of the ritual of paraduma. They all require a lazar HaKohen to the exclusion of a zar. Now let's try to analyze Shmuel. Shmuel the Omar Paro, meaning Paro shel Kohen Gadol the shchita psula b'zar ma'ishna Paro. Why is it that you disqualify the shchita b'zar in the case of the Parashal Kohen Gadol? Again, Shmuel, you should be consistent. The Siv, it says in the Parashat Parashal Aaron, Vikriv Aaron is Parachatos. And on that it says Chukah at the end of the Parashat to tell me that Chukah applies to all the avodas of Yoma Kippur. And therefore you can apply it to shchita as well. Paranavi, be consistent. In the case of Parah HaKsiv, El Lazar, it says El Lazar v'chukah. In this case, chukah happens to be in the pasuk before El Lazar, but it doesn't matter. It means we should demand and require that Dafka El Lazar is kosher b'tchit sapara, and if it should be possible bizarre, Shani Hasam, the Gemara defends Shmuel and explains that according to Shmuel, there's a fundamental difference here. In the case of paraduma, even though it says El Lazar v'chukah, nevertheless shchita is ksheira bizarre. Why? The siv. Because the pasuk, I'll read the whole pasuk. It says at the beginning of Perek Yutes, it says, "V'nasatem osa el Lazar kohen v'shachat osa lifanav." Somebody is shechting lifanav. Notice the ratio of the pasuk refers to El Lazar, and the sefer in the word lifanav is telling that Mishachat also somebody other than Elazar HaKohen is going to shech the para in the presence of Elazar. Sheizar Shochev Elazar Roa. Now, I'm not exactly sure here. I tried to find an answer to this question. We'll leave it now for the time being. Why it's so important that Elazar HaKohen be there to see the shechita. I mean, what is he supervising the shechita? Make sure it's a shechita ksher. I'm not sure, but the word lefanav here means a shechita v'zar in the presence of Elazar, and that proves that shechita's paraduma, according to Shmuel, is ksher v'zar. The Gemara asks for Rav. What is Rav going to do with the word lefanav? It cannot be the way Shmuel says lefanav means somebody is shechting the paraduma in the presence of Elazar, because it's Elazar himself, according to Rav in this pasuk, who is doing the shechita. So what does it mean that he, Elazar, does the shechita in front of him? What does that mean? And the Gemara answers that Rav will derive from this pasuk lefanav that the shechita has to be every moment befanav. What does that mean? That he is not Mesiach Das. That means he is totally obsessed, single-mindedly focused on the shechita, the paraduma, to make sure that nothing that would disqualify the paraduma would occur, and it wouldn't come in contact with anything that might be metamid, etc., etc., etc. And that requires total awareness. Without any esech hadas, he's not allowed to discontinue his awareness for one moment. And that shmira from psulim is absolutely critical. So Shmuel also agrees that there's no allowance and no leniency for hesech hadas, but he uses the word lefanav to indicate that the shechita of somebody else has to happen in front of the Kohen Gadol, in front of Lazar. What's the source for this din that in the process of the avoda of the paraduma there should be no hesech hadas? He should not be distracted in any way. Nafkale mi v'saraf es hapara le'einav. The word le'einav in this pasuk is coming to teach us that there should not be any hesech hadas. And even though the pasuk is referring specifically to Sreifa, but we believe in Shmuel's perspective that we're not going to limit this pasuk to the Sreifa, but we're going to apply it to the entire process that began with Shechita. And just like Shmuel derived from the Chachato Solofanav, that we're not going to interpret it in the way of Hesech Hadas, but rather we're going to refer to the Shechita that came before it, we're going to also interpret the word lefanav as referring back to Elazar, and not on Vishachat. And in the case of Sreifa, where Elazar's name is not mentioned in this pasuk, we're not going to say that li'enav should be interpreted on the Visara, which comes right near it, because if that be the case, the pasuk is talking about one person, that's Elazar, who's mentioned earlier. Now, the question now arises, if the word li'enav is sufficient grounds to derive the principle of lo yasiach daito, then according to Rav, why do I need both lefanav and li'enav? The Rav, we need a special pasuk of shelo yasiach daito b'shchita and a special one for sreifa. Why? Because of Rachmana b'shchita, if the Torah only told me about the Yisrael that's during shchita, I could not derive any conclusions about Sreifas HaParah. Why? Mishum detchilas havoda. This is the kickoff, the beginning stage, the first avoda that will culminate in the paraduma. Avol Sreifa below. Since Sreifa is at the end of the process, he's already set it up as he's already engendered the shmira of the paraduma without any psulim. Then let him finish it up with Sreifa. So I need a pasuk to teach me ve'inecha le'ena that there's no hesech hadas allowed during Sreifa. Because Rachmana b'Sreifa. On the other hand, I might have thought that Sreifa is the key of keys. It's the most important strict element in the requirements of paraduma. Mishum dahashta hudim is kasher para. because the whole purpose, the agenda, the goal of creating this paraduma is for the Afer to get the ashes at the point in which we burn the paraduma. Therefore, you're not allowed to be Mesiach Das B'Sreifal. Shchita Imalo. Shchita is only a preliminary stage here to get the ball rolling. It's not, that element of critical completion that gets us the kasher sapara. Therefore, I might think we could lower our guard as far as Hesek Hadas Tzricha. Therefore, I need the pasuk of Lefanov to indicate that even the shchita generates an isur of Hesek Hadas. Now, the Gemara at this point is going to try to clarify which of the avodas of the para require absolute concentration with no distraction, no hesek hadas. Where is the Isur hesek hadas? Now, we know about shchita, we know about streifa, but what about the other avodas? So the Gemara asks, lemute mai. In other words, if the Torah singles out shchita and streifa with an Isur hesek hadas, apparently it's coming lemute to exclude other avodos that are performed with regard to the Torah, and they're excluded. They don't require absolute concentration, meaning there's no psul of hesek hadas in other avodos. Which avodos do you have in mind? And in those avodos, there's no psul of hesek hadas. Let's just very quickly give a little bit of an overview of the various avodos in the paraduma. Number one, shchita, v'shachato solofanov. Number two, kabbalas hadam. And then after he receives the dam, hazas hadam, with his fingers, sheva pavim keneged kodesh kadoshim. The pasuk says, "V'lakachal azar kohen mitoma betzva'o v'zol nochach pnei ol moed mitoma sheva pavim." That's why, by the way, the kohen has to see all the way to the heichal. Then we get to streifa sapar, v'sarafa sapar leinon. But that's not the be all and the end all. We now have the Afer of the Parah, which is wonderful. We've done the Azah after the Shkita, now we have the Afer of Parah. But now we get to the fourth segment of the Avodah, Hashlachas, Agudas, abound, Eitz Erez, the Azov, Ushni Tolas. And again, translating this roughly, we're talking about a cedar branch and hyssop, and we throw all these ingredients into the fire, and the Torah says, now we have this whole cholent, this whole mixture, which has Afer, and it has Eitz Erez, Ezov, Shni Tolas. We get to Ketisha. Ketisha means we crush everything, we gather it together in a kli, and then we take another kli, fill it up with mayim chayim, as the Torah says, mayim chayim el keli. We sanctify the mayim by pouring it into the Ephra para, and we make a mixture of the two, and that's called v'lakhu l'tamei me'efar me'afar sreifa sachatos v'nosan olav mayim chayim. Finally, we do what's called the tefillah, a tefillah of another agudas ezov into the mayim. L'lachach ezov v'tava b'mayim ish tahar, and hazah samayim al atamei shenemar v'hisa atar al atamei b'yom hashlishi b'yom hashvi'i. Ilema says the Gemara ute asifas afara. When we gather together the Ephra Apara, and it says v'yasaf ish tahar es Ephra Apara v'niach nichut tzamach l'makom tar v'hoisol adas b'nei yisol mishmeres umili amayim, and filling up mayim chayim in a kli l'kiddush in order to sanctify the mayim, and he's going to then mix the Ephra and the mayim in order to be mazal l'tamei, as it says v'lakvo al tamei me'afar tzreifa sachatus and asan alav mayim chayim el keli. And are we going to say that all of these are avodos, meaning asifas hapara, asifas Ephra hapara, and mili mayim, all of these do not require total focus and concentration, and they allow for hesek hadas? The Gemara says here on the top of the Daf and Beis, you cannot say that these avodos were excluded because the Torah says limishmeres l'mein nidok sil.